So, Frank, today I thought we needed to do more to contextualize the sort of thing we were talking about last time that had to do with changes in gender relations. The changes in the Middle East are very obvious, and the Middle East seems to always be in the news, and anything in the news that comes from the Middle East seems to have something to do with gender. But that depending upon the time scale you're thinking in, these things look very different. Most of our news is in the time scale of what happened today in relation to what happened last week, and then if you read investigative journalism, it'll take you back a bit further, and if you start reading history, it will take you back further still, but modern history usually doesn't go back beyond 100 years, and longer term history doesn't get read very much more. But in the way we're trying to understand globalization, we have to take account also of the time scales of not only of historians, but of people like Charles Darwin and even Stephen Hawking, because so much of what we do today looks very different, but in fact the shadow of the past is over us, and even though to some extent there are beams of light from the past that illuminate us, we have to worry about what genetic programming is doing to our behavior, and the degree to which we are able to affect that genetic programming by modern reasoning, cultural elaboration, and even legislation, and the effects of the Enlightenment and ideals about what society really should be like that is different from our evolutionary past. So thinking about these differences in time scale and the way they each play into the present in one way or another, I thought we might look back at the gender situation and the way it's been evolving in the Middle East, and relate that to a larger context that has to do with interpersonal relations in the modern world and the way that perhaps that's been changing, and violence in general, and whether violence in the modern world appears now to be different from what it used to be or not. So what's been in the news recently that you think requires some sort of explanation from this point of view?
I think that the very first thing that comes to mind is a horrible, horrible story that Al Jazeera has been following quite closely. And that is, this is going to sound beyond imagination, apparently a very systematically organized effort by Muammar Gaddafi's government to employ certain elements of the army assisted with male potency enhancement drugs, specifically Viagra mentioned, to set about organized raping of women in rebel strongholds that have been retaken by the loyalist armies. And when I heard your contextualization remarks, I thought of the oldest possible violence that could be done against women, rape, from the beginning of Neanderthal time, certainly through the beginning of humanity, now being sponsored on a state level in what is arguably a second and a half world or second world country in Libya, and in the Middle East with the Islamic overtones. I'm wondering, in the terms of, I guess, perspective insofar as the relations between men and women and government effects of whatever might be going on in those relations, as well as the globalization effects of the reporting of these events. I mean, how does this fit in with what you were referring to at the beginning?
That really is a remarkable piece of news, and I wonder how that's going to be dealt with by journalists in the coming days. And I'm surprised in a way that it hasn't already been taken up with more visibility than I've seen so far. because it's...
If I may interrupt, the articles are citing as well that the United Nations, of all people, not usually the fastest people off the mark, have now taken great umbrage with this and are adding it to the list of atrocities for which Gaddafi must be held accountable.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I hadn't seen, and I'm very glad to hear that. But what's particularly remarkable about it is that rape is one of the oldest types of violence that are common in warfare, and the drugs that are being used are some of the most modern drugs being used to promote this type of violence in a part of the world which is the most conservative with relation to gender relations. So it's a remarkable mixture of elements that have significance in different timescales. The modern pharmaceutical industry, Islamic civilization, and the history of warfare.
Not to mention the development or improvement of gender relations.
It's remarkable, actually, the degree to which women have been drawn into the conflict in each of the Arab countries that have come into the news over the last 6 months. They've been very prominent in Egypt, in Syria, in Bahrain, and now, well, among the rebels in Benghazi and Libya, they've been receiving training in use of weapons, and now, of course, they're being used as part of the offense in Tripoli, on the other side of Libya. I think that the important part of the historical context of this is that until really the end of the bipolar era, say 1991, the bipolar era, of course, in terms of the difference of time perspectives we're currently talking in, is quite a short one, since it was just from 1945 to 1991. But in those terms, probably human history up to the end of the bipolar era, not just the period of the bipolar division of the world itself, warfare was between an in-group and another country, another nation, another tribe, another people that you didn't recognize as part of your own group. And so when you were committing violence in warfare, for the most part, one can find exceptions to this, I think, probably especially in the 19th century, but for the most part, up until 1991, when you were fighting an enemy, you were fighting people who were different from you in social as well as national terms. And now, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we very soon gave up the idea of a unipolar era and started looking for something else, and finished up in really thinking in terms of globalization. The main episodes of violence have erupted within societies and torn societies apart. In the Balkans, where the people who were fighting each other were identified with different groups that were all intermarried on an enormous scale. And now, of course, in the Arab Spring, this is violence within national societies, which...
So the absence, you're suggesting that the absence of the bipolarity now in the last 20 years has in fact led to an easing of the wanton ability to do harm to people outside of your ethnic group, your tribal group, whatever, and now is leading to a more fratricidal context, fighting, if you will, within a particular ethnic group or a strata or a tribe?
I think violence has a different meaning for us now that it's not violence against strangers that we didn't accept in our own society to begin with, but violence that's erupting within societies that we thought were national ethnic communities, all with a heritage that goes back to the Enlightenment, that sees value in equality and equal rights and so on.
That's very interesting.
And so this is probably the first time in human history that violence is tearing societies apart rather than functioning in the seams between societies, forming the boundaries between social units.
If you looked at and again, not to over dramatize this, but if you looked at the Arab Spring in that context and looked at that crescent or arc across northern Africa heading east into Saudi Arabia and further on perhaps as well, societally, those are words, unitary wise in one social group, I mean, how coalesced is that group? Do people in Libya, for example, all the way on the western edge of that arc, do they identify in some respects with Muslims in Saudi Arabia on the eastern end of the arc? I mean, is the violence within that group, if it was to be perpetrated against each other? I mean, do the national boundaries mean that much along these lines?
National boundaries, I mean, all the national boundaries in the Islamic world are the creation of the colonial era, and none of the boundaries were fixed before the 1890s, and most of them weren't fixed until the 1920s or even the 1960s. However, even though Islam is a much more universalistic religion and has always had the sense much more than, I mean, Christians have always been divided among different churches, even before the Reformation, because they were allegiance was to a bishop, and the bishops had to meet together to agree in order to give the Pope the legitimacy to lead the church. But in Islam, for 1500 years, there has been this sense among all Muslims from the Atlantic coast as far east as China, and including, of course, large parts of South and Southeast Asia, that anybody who's a Muslim belongs to one social unit, the Ummah, and they meet together when they go on pilgrimage in Mecca. However, that really has never functioned as a unit. But in the last 100 years, because of the influence of ideas from the West, and also because of the way society generally throughout the world has been changing, people do think in terms of national societies, and they have national governments. And so the people in Libya were Libyans, and people in Syria were Syrians.
So, in terms of the ebbing of the bipolarity, then, and the willingness of society to do violence against other members of their own ethnic groups or cultural groups, and then it would stand to reason then that universality of Islam is no longer a vaccination, if you will, against intra-Islamic violence itself.
Well, before the colonial period, violence within the Islamic world was generally political violence of one person trying to set himself up as a center of political power against rivals. During the colonial period, that sort of violence was suppressed, and then during the bipolar period, either America and its allies or the Soviet Union and its allies would make sure that each government within its zone of influence was able to control its population, and so any internal violence was then suppressed. But it looks as though we're going to have to continue this in our next session because we've run out of time.
All right, we'll be happy to do that from this end. Thank you for your time today.